Many of you reached out to me to ask me about visas related to international medical graduates when they're applying for residency. And since I'm not an expert in that, I brought a lawyer to tell you all the details about the visas for international medical graduates. Naveen, welcome to the channel. Can we start by introducing yourself to the viewers and telling them about your expertise in that field?
Thank you so much for this invitation. Yes, so my name is Naveen Bora. I'm a corporate immigration attorney. I've been practicing in this field for well over 20 years. I'm with a law firm called WR Immigration, and I manage our New York practice. I'm actually married to an international medical graduate who is now a thoracic surgeon, so I'm very familiar with the process of going through the different hurdles of immigration as an IMG. And I've been working with countless physicians from Pakistan and other countries and helping them through the process of getting the visas, and then once they're here and completing residency, what the next steps are.
That's awesome. I'm very honored and glad to have you here on the channel. So I want to start by asking you about the options that international medical graduates have when they apply for residency. What type of visas can they apply to?
Yeah, so for GME, the two most common visas are the J1 and the H1, and we can talk about those in much more detail. If there are any of you who are Australian citizens, there is the option to complete your residency on the E3 visa, which is specifically for Australian citizens.
Awesome. Since the J1 is one of the most common ones, we'll start with that. Can you tell us about the criteria for getting the J1 visa for, let's say, an international medical graduate from India or from Russia, China? They're applying to residency, they match into residency, and now they want to start residency in July. And the option that the program has is only J1. What do they need to do to get this visa?
Sure. So the typical timeline is that you find out in the match in March that you've gotten into a program, which is fantastic. All the J1s for GME are actually done through ECFMG, which is an organization I'm sure you guys are all familiar with, and they're the only sponsor for the J1 program. They're the only authorized sponsor by the State Department. And so what happens is once you've matched, you will work with ECFMG and provide them all the documents so that they can issue you something called the form DS2019, and that's the form that you need to then apply for your J1 visa at the US consulate. The basic requirements for the J1 with ECFMG are, to show that you have the contract with the program, you've completed your USMLE steps 1 and 2. They will also request a statement of need from the Ministry of Health from your home country. And so typically you go through this process and you're able to obtain that DS 2019 form around the end of April, beginning of May. And from there on, you go through the process of actually applying for the visa.
Awesome. The question I get asked about the most when it comes to J1 visa, which is the statement of need and the 2-year home requirement. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what does that mean for IMGs applying for J1?
Yeah, so one of the, before we talk about the disadvantages of the J1, which is the 2-year home residence requirement, I did want to just mention that the J1 is the most common visa for completing your residency. And actually there are 2 advantages of the J1 in that first of all, there's a 7-year limit to the J1, which is typically sufficient time for somebody to complete all of their training. And especially if you're going through a process, or your specialty is in surgery that requires much longer time, then the J1 is the best option for you. It is possible to get an 8th or 9th year J1 if you can show that there's unique need in your home country for that specialty. And so part of getting the J1 is to show that there is this need in your home country for a particular expertise, and you will need that statement of need at the beginning for your initial J1, and then also if you're intending to then apply for an 8th or 9th year J1 because you're in a longer track program. One other advantage of the J1 is that the spouse comes on a J2 and they're able to also obtain an employment authorization card. So I would say those are the 2 main advantages. The disadvantage, of course, is that you become subject to that 2-year home residence requirement. The J1 is an exchange visitor program visa. So what it means is that the whole idea is that you're coming to the United States to gain a specific knowledge, and that you're going to go back to your home country and take that knowledge back for the benefit of your home country. And so it's been recognized that there is a shortage of healthcare workers in countries. And so the United States is giving the opportunity for someone to come here, get training, and then take that knowledge back to their home country. And that's really the reason for this 2-year home residence requirement. What that means is that once you enter the United States in J1 status for GME, you immediately become subject to this requirement. And that basically means that you can't get a green card, an H visa, or an L visa, which is an intercompany transfer visa, until you've gone back to the country that's listed on your DS 2019 as your primary residence country, and you've completed 2 years there. Now you can complete the 2 years in aggregate, so over a span of several years, or you could do it, in one chunk. But you do need to complete that before you can get a green card. This can play out. For example, you're here on a J1, you're married to a U.S. citizen. You still need to complete this 2-year home residence requirement before you can get a green card through your marriage to a U.S. citizen.
Awesome. So the advantages are that if you have a J1, you have 7 years to complete your training, and in certain circumstances, you might extend that. And your spouse would be on the J2, and they would get an EAD, work authorization, and they would be able to work in the US to support themselves and support the family.
Yeah, and actually we often see a lot of couples who are both in medicine, and so the one will be starting their J1 training, and then the spouse gets the employment authorization card, the EAD, and then also starts a residency program with the EAD. Now the spouse, the J2, is also subject to that 2-year home residence requirement. So they will need to make sure that 2-year home residence requirement is dealt with before they can transition to a different work visa or get a green card. Another thing to be aware of is that if you have both couples doing residency on the J1, timing can be a little bit tight. So if the principal J1's program ends and the J2 is still completing their program, they will need to also then switch to a J1, because they will lose employment authorization once the principal J1 has finished.
Oh, that's a great point. So the 2-year home residency requirement, I've seen so many IMGs who come here and they are able to stay without going back. Can you explain how can they do that?
Yeah, so if you don't want to go back home and you have an offer of employment, it is possible to get a waiver of this 2-year home residence requirement. Most people get a waiver through support of an interested government agency. They're called IGAs, and the most common one is through a state CONRAD program. The CONRAD program is set up so that every state has 30 slots or waivers that they can support, and they want to see that you're going to be working in an underserved community, that you're helping people, who live in a medically underserved area, or what's called a healthcare professional shortage area, or HPSA, and they give specific, support for people who are in primary care or pediatrics or psychiatry. So those are the folks that get most of the slots, but all states typically have 5 that they set aside for people who are working in what's considered a flex slot, meaning that even though the facility or the hospital is not in an underserved area, if they can demonstrate that the patients are coming from underserved areas, then you could still get one of these one of these Conrad waivers. And then there are also states that support specialists as well. So you can get around the waiver requirement, around the 2-year residence requirement by obtaining a waiver through an IGA. The Veterans Administration also supports the waivers. So that's doing it through work. If you are married to a US citizen or you have a US citizen child, and they would suffer some type of exceptional hardship, if you were to go back to your home country, then you can also get a waiver through that relationship. And then lastly, if there's a fear of persecution, very similar to an asylum application, that you're fearing for your safety by going back to your home country, you can also get a waiver based on persecution.
Wow, that's awesome. And I'm interested in doing another detailed video about the waiver with you. But for people who are interested in learning more about the waiver or discussing their options, do you think it's something they can do on their own, or they need help from someone who is specialized in this, and why?
Definitely for the waivers, you should work with an immigration attorney or counsel. Typically, if you're going through the waiver through employment, the first thing that happens is that you will get a contract for that job, and we recommend that you always retain an attorney to review the contract to make sure that you're not that the terms are fair, and also that they're in compliance with the J1 program requirements. So we recommend having an attorney for that process and negotiating the contract. And then certainly going through the waiver application, you should also have an attorney. It's possible that the employer has legal counsel that they work with, and you would just work with that attorney. When it comes to waiver applications for based on persecution or hardship, then I 100% highly recommend that you work with an attorney for that. They are very, very document heavy applications, and it's really good to have an expert help you in putting that application together.
Definitely agree with that, because there are some areas of the law that you might read Google, like in medicine, people ask Dr. Google and get some medical advice, but there are so many details and nuances that go beyond that.
Yeah, no, certainly the government, the way immigration is set up, there's several different agencies involved. There's the State Department, Immigration, DHS, Departments of Health. And so it can be really overwhelming and confusing. And so highly recommend getting appropriate help and legal counsel.
Awesome. So we discussed the J1, the advantages, disadvantages. The other one that seems more appealing to people is the H1 visa. Can you tell us a little bit about the requirements of this visa?
Yeah, so the H1 is the most common work visa, and a lot of people really would like to do the residency on an H1 because then they can avoid the whole 2-year home residence requirement. A lot of programs will not support an H1 simply because they're really expensive. There's the filing is with USCIS, and there are a lot of government filing fees associated with an H1b filing. The other, caution for H1s for residency is that it is limited to 6 years. So if you are, if you've already used up some of your H1B time doing research here prior to residency, you may not have too many years left of H1. And then also if you are doing something other than internal medicine, where you require several years to complete your training, then you're going to run out of H1B time. The H1 is, it requires all of your USMLE steps, and then a medical degree, and the petition is actually filed by the hospital or your employer. You can't self-petition for the H1. And so first the petition is filed with immigration, and then if you're outside the United States, you wait for immigration to approve the petition, and then you receive what's called an I-797, and then based on that, you would apply for your H1 visa. And then if you have a spouse or minor children, they would apply for the H4 visa and can accompany you here on the H4. Unlike the J2, the H4 spouses do not have employment authorization, so they can be here to live here with you, but they're not going to have any form of work authorization.
That's a big difference if someone is coming here on H1 and they want their spouse to work and now they're not able to work. Is there any way around it, or they can get their own visa if they're...
Yeah, sure. They would have to get their own sponsorship. So, if they are able to apply and get an offer of employment, then their employer would go through the steps of finding the appropriate work visa for them.
And you mentioned that the H1 has a 6-year time limit, and that this J1 has 7, but we can extend it. Is there a way to, or exceptions around the 6 years for the H1?
That's a great question. So you actually need to start the green card process in order to go beyond that 6-year limit. So, if you are able to complete your 3 years of internal medicine residency and then typically get a job, then you would apply for a green card through your employer during that time. If you're going to go for, I don't know, 2 years fellowship and you only have 1 year left, then you would have to talk to your prospective employer and see if they can start a green card process for you before you even start, because you really don't have much time to finish the green card process before you run out of H1B time. If you are doing a lot of research and writing while you're in residency, then you may qualify for a different work visa, which is called an O1, as a person of extraordinary ability. So some people who use up their H1B time are able to then transition to an O1 as a person of extraordinary ability. But for the O1, you do need to show sustained achievement, that you at the top of your field, you have a lot of publications, citations. So it is a pretty high bar to meet, but certainly physicians publish and are, they go for speaking engagements, things like that. So it's definitely doable.
I think we covered that already, but can we summarize in a few minutes the advantages, disadvantages of the H1 visa?
So the H1B visa advantage is that there's no 2-year home residence requirement. Also another big advantage of the H1 is that when you apply for the visa at the US consulate, it is considered a dual intent visa. So as long as you have an offer of employment and you're qualified, you should be able to get the visa. The J1, in contrast, it does not have that dual intent. So with the J1, you have to convince the consular officer that you're actually going to go back home after you complete your training. So the J1 can be a little bit more tough in terms of getting that visa as opposed to the H1. And then the H1, you can transition to the green card a lot more easily because there's no 2-year home residence requirement.
For our viewers who are not familiar with dual intent means that you can come here as a non-immigrant individual and also have the intent of getting a green card and become a resident here in the US?
Yes, that's correct. Yes, dual intent means that you have the desire to live here permanently, in addition to this immediate intention to complete training.
Perfect. So now we covered the J1, H1, which are the 2 most common visas. I want to talk now a little bit about the transition between the different visas. But before we do that, can you explain a little bit the difference between having a visa and having a status?
That's a great question. So the visa is the sticker that's placed in your passport by the State Department, by the US consulate, and it enables you to travel to the United States. Status means that once you arrive in the United States, CBP, which is Customs and Border Protection, is the agency that admits you to the United States in a certain status. And so your status is determined by, if you're on a J1, your DS-2019. The DS-2019 form is typically given annually. So every year you'll get a new 2019 form from ECFMG and it's valid for a year. And as long as you are receiving those DS 2019 forms from ECFMG, you're maintaining your J1 status and completing your training. The visa is just a travel document and enables you to then exit and re-enter the United States. So it's possible that your J1 visa may be only for a year. You've come into the United States, but to enable you to continue to live and work in the United States, you need to make sure that you're maintaining status by having ECFMG issue that DS 2019 form to you. The H1Bs are typically given for 3 years. And so the status determination by the H1 is the approval notice that you receive from USCIS, which is US Citizenship and Immigration Services. And then when you enter the United States on an H1B visa, you will present your approval notice from immigration, and then Customs and Border Protection will then admit you in H1B status for the duration of your petition, which is typically that 3 years. And so, yes, I know it can be really confusing. There are some countries where just depending on what's considered a reciprocity or agreement between the two countries, the visa sticker may have a different duration than the petition. So if, for example, you're from China, you may or get a visa that's only for 1 year and for a single or 2 entries. Whereas if you're from India, you will get a visa that's for 3 years and it's multiple entry. And those are just determined by the 2 countries. But once you're in the United States, you do need to make sure you're maintaining status. And that's through the approval notice, your DS 2019 form, and then the I-94 is your arrival record number that CBP issues to you. And it's really important that every time you travel to the United States, you actually look up your I-94 on the CBP's website to make sure that you're admitted for the time that you thought you were admitted, because sometimes they make a mistake or they may even cut your admission short to match your passport. So it's always good to check your I-94 record as well.
Awesome.
Okay, am I getting too detailed in this?
I think the idea of status versus visa is very unique to the US, because in countries like Europe, when you go and you get a visa for a year, that means you can go back and forth to your country and Europe during that duration. If you extend it in Europe, you'd be able to go back and forth. But correct me if I'm wrong, if you come here, let's say in 2021, you have a visa, J1, and you're admitted on this J1 status for 1 year. If you extend it in the US, you won't get a visa, you would get a status. But if you leave the US, you won't be able to come back unless you apply for another visa, even if your status is valid, correct?
That's correct, yes. So the visa is purely for travel. So if you have no intention of traveling abroad, then you can just be here, even though the sticker in your passport has expired, but you are continuing to receive DS 2019 forms from ECFMG. But then keep in mind that when you do travel, you will need to go back to your home country to get the visa issued in your passport again. There are some countries where you can apply as a third country national. So, before COVID, people would go to a US consulate in the Caribbean or to Canada to get their visa stamps renewed because home was too far. But they did need to make sure that they always had a valid visa in their passport if they were going to travel.
Is that still an option, like going to Canada or Mexico?
It's becoming more of an option now that the consulates are reopening. During COVID, they basically suspended routine visa processing, and they had very few appointments available. Thankfully, within healthcare, there is always a solid argument that you provide a critical need in the United States, and so physicians were able to get expedited appointments as third country nationals in, for example, a US consulate in Mexico. Canada was a little bit more difficult because they had really, really tight restrictions on people visiting Canada. And then for the US consulates in the Caribbean, they are slowly reopening now. It can be a bit of a challenge to secure an appointment, but if this is a visa renewal, meaning you've got your first J1 in your home country, and now you're just trying to renew that visa, as long as you secure your appointment, you should be fine in going to a third country for your visa process. But we always recommend that you consult with your immigration attorney to make sure that you have all your documents in order before you travel.
Awesome. Now I want to cover a few situations that IMGs might be running into. Let's say
Sure.
an IMG has a B1 visa, B1 status in the US, or F1. They're a student here in the medical school in the US. They want to apply to residency. How does this transition work to J1 work?
So the B1 is probably the more common one, where someone comes to the United States to, for their interviews, for example, or they're here for visit. The B1, B2 is limited to, typically 6 months, and it is a tourist visa. So you're not supposed to, have the intention of staying here and working or applying for residency, which is a form of employment. And so you are supposed to go back home after you receive your J1 DS 2019 form and apply for the visa in your home country, and not apply for a change of status in the United States. Now, if you're here in the US and you've been here for a few months, meaning more than 3 months, and you have time left on your I-94 period of admission, then you could look into applying to change your status within the United States from the B1 or B2 to a J1 or an H1. A word of caution there is that the J1 change of status in the United States can take a very long time. It's done through an application form called an I-539. It's not possible to pay for any expedite, and it can take months. So very likely you will not be able to start your program on time because your change of status is still in process, and you can't start work or your residency until it's actually approved. So we don't recommend doing a change of status in the United States for J1s. For H1s, it may be possible because there is an option to premium process, which is an additional filing fee that you pay of $2,500, but immigration will then adjudicate your petition within a 2-week period. So it may be possible to have an H1B change of status done within, in a timely manner for your program start date. But again, you can't apply immediately, and every situation is a little bit unique. So we would advise you to consult with the attorney to see if a change of status is appropriate, or it would be better for you to just go home, pick up the H1B visa, and then come to the United States.
Is it similar for the F1?
So F1, you can actually, F1s are a little bit unique. So when you complete a degree in the United States, you can get an employment authorization card called an OPT. It's an optional practical training employment authorization card, and those are given for 1 year. So it's possible that you could start your 1 year of residency on the OPT and then transition from that to an H1 for the remaining time. There's also a STEM extension for an additional 2 years. So actually, Malki, that's another way to do residency is off the F1, but eventually you will need to transition off of the F1, and you can certainly switch to an H1 off of an F1, but it would be more challenging to do a change of status from an F to a J. So you would have to go back to your home country to get the J1. And then there may be some rules on transitioning from an F1 to a J1. So I would say that you should consult with ECFMG to make sure that they're on board and would support you on the J1 off of an F1.
Awesome. Now talking about J1 to J1, some people start research, they're on J1 research, and they transition to J1 clinical.
Yep.
There are a 2-year requirement for J1 research, and how is the transition from research to clinical work?
Yeah. So in addition to becoming subject to that 2-year home residence requirement through graduate medical education, you can also become subject by if there's any form of government funding for your research. So if you are coming here on a Fulbright, for example, then your J1 research visa will make you subject. If you're coming from a country that the State Department has designated to have a shortage of a specific skill, so that's the skills list, then you can also become subject based on that. But a lot of countries, a lot of people who are coming here for J1 research, they don't get any, they're self-sponsored or funded, so they don't get any form of government funding, and they're from a country that is not on the skills list. So coming here on the J1 research is fine. You can transition to an H1 or J1 for graduate medical education. ECFMG, when you are transitioning from J1 research to J1 clinical, will ask you to explain the link or the nexus between your J1 research and the clinical, and how it sort of falls in line. And so you just need to be able to explain how your research is, there's an appropriate transition from the research to the clinical. It's the same area of work. And then they will typically then support that and issue you the DS 2019 for the J1 clinical. You will need to, if you are subject to the 2-year home residence requirement based on J1 research, you are able to get the J1 for clinical if ECFMG supports it, and then you will need to get a new visa and then come back to the US on that J1 clinical visa.
But you kind of postpone your 2 years for research to after you finish your clinical. You can do that, right?
You mean like during your clinical training, you want to do research?
No, I mean, let's say somebody started on J1 research, they have the 2-year requirement. They can start their residency on J1 clinical and then do the 2-year requirement.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Now the question that I also get asked about, somebody starts on J1 clinical for their residency and now they're looking into fellowship. I assume they can't get the H1 now because they are subject to the 2-year requirement?
Yes, that's correct.
And what if somebody started residency on H1 and applied for fellowships, and sometimes you're limited by the options. You have, for example, 5 fellowships that sponsor H1 to continue the H1, but the rest are all J1 and you didn't match in the H1 ones and you're stuck with the J1. What happens in this situation? Do they become subject to the 2-year requirement, or what happens?
Yeah, so you can always switch to a J1 off of an H1, right? So you could even be in a situation where you might have started your residency on H1 and then 2 years into it decide that you're going to switch to a J1. So you could do that. You can also complete 3 years of residency on the H1 and then for your fellowship switch to a J1. But whenever you get on that J1, day one, you become subject to that 2-year home residence requirement. The other thing to keep in mind is that if you're going to do a waiver job to, so that you can avoid going home for 2 years, you do need to spend 3 years in H1b status as part of your J1 waiver job obligation. So you will need to make sure that you have 3 years of H1b time left to do that.
That's a great point. That's something I was not aware of. So if you already used 4 or 5 years of your H1 during residency fellowship and then you got stuck with the J1, you won't have much time left for the waiver to work here.
Yeah, it gets really complicated, and so then you would have to make sure that you start a green card process, through an employer ahead of time, so you fit into one of those exceptions for a 7th or 8th year H1b.
That's why I highly recommend a lawyer, and Naveen is here available.
Thank you. Yes, immigration law keeps us employed. It's very
complicated, and there is a billion type of visas and nuances, every type, like subtypes of visas. So I highly recommend, if you need help and you're looking to apply to residency fellowship, to seek immigration lawyer, so you won't be stuck afterwards and say, oh, I wish I knew that before. So I highly recommend, if you need help, seek out somebody who's expert, and I'm going to leave the links for Naveen's firm, so you can reach out to her and discuss with her all your issues or questions that you have.
Thank you. And you actually made a really great point. We are very, very specialized in just within the practice of law in the United States. So, you really need to go to somebody who specializes in this niche field. And there is a very active international medical graduate bar association specifically for physician-related issues because they are so complicated.
Well, thank you so much, Naveen, for coming on the channel. We'll definitely do more videos in the future about the O1, the national interest waiver, the research, all these aspects to cover all the aspects that IMGs need to learn. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
For our viewers, if you have any questions, reach out to Naveen, leave your questions and comment below, or reach out to me on Instagram or Twitter at Malki Assad or my Facebook page, Malki Assad MD. I'll definitely will not be able to answer legal questions. And this episode is definitely not a legal advice because, as I said, there are nuances that relates to every applicant that would be it might not apply to this discussion that we were having. So if you have a question and need an actual legal advice, reach out to Naveen or any expert immigration lawyer in that domain to help you with your questions. Thank you everyone so much for watching and see you in future videos.